The first thing we're going to talk about today is how to characterize. What are the details that make a character spring to life? How do we introduce characters, minor and major? And then we're going to talk about how to go beyond the obvious. How to introduce an element of eccentricity and contrast, which will really make the character leap off the page. So I'm really excited. Let's get into it. One thing I should mention, this episode applies to fiction and nonfiction alike. Today's advice is mostly based on two texts. James Wood, the renowned book critic from The New Yorker, his book How Fiction Works, and Sol Stein, a really luminary editor who passed away not too long ago, Stein on writing. He edited James Baldwin, George Orwell, Lionel Trilling, just a lion among editors. To begin with, we'll use a version of an example that Stein liked to talk about, and we'll do it through a Seinfeld clip. So watch this clip. George Costanza is about to meet someone. And just think about the most basic way in which you would describe this person.
You know what I'd like to do? I'd really like to have sex with a tall woman. I don't know.
Excuse me. I was walking behind you and you dropped your wallet.
You probably thought, as we all do, she was a tall blonde. Compare it with when she entered the room, George realized her feet would hang over his bed. Not only do we grasp that she's tall, without resorting to a cliche, tall blonde, but we see her in the context of George's desire. Minor characters usually help characterize major characters in a story. What's the other difference? We see her doing something. She's lying down. Sol Stein put it this way: avoid telling the reader what your character is like. Let the reader see your characters talking and doing things. Here's an example from Nancy Kincaid. She doesn't write, "Skippy is brave." Instead, she writes, "Skippy will pick up a snake as quick as he will a cat. He will let one crawl on his neck and down his arm, a black snake, until me and Roy go crazy watching him." In both of these examples, we see characters doing something. And you guessed it, this is the old show don't tell, but in more specific terms. Here are the 5 ways to characterize. The first is through action. Second is dialogue. Third is physical attributes. Fourth is clothing. And fifth is psychological attributes. Make it visual whenever possible. Here's an example from Maupassant. It's a physical attribute and an action in one. He was a gentleman with red whiskers who always went first through a doorway. With one sentence, the reader immediately has a sense of who this man is. He's the man who always goes first through the doorway. Something else you'll probably notice as we go through the examples of each way of characterizing is that exaggeration is a good tool to use in conjunction with these. Laverne weighs 2 tons naked. Exaggeration, but it's very effective. Now let's move into dialogue. In another example, he says, imagine one character has been waiting for another for a while. Now what's a typical piece of dialogue one would use? I've been waiting for you a long time. But here's what Rita Mae Brown does in this instance in High Hearts. Girl, my fingernails could grow an inch just waiting for you. How much more effective is that? Doesn't that tell you something about a character? I've been waiting for you a long time. Says nothing. It doesn't give us any context. But this immediately lets us know what kind of person, what kind of sassy person this is. As Stein says, don't just pass on information. Give people a sense of the person. And this is a James Wood example from Madame Bovary. The movie, and this will happen a couple of times in this episode, the movie isn't going to adhere to the text entirely. So we're using the movie for, to get a sense of the atmosphere of that scene of the novel. Emma Bovary and her husband Charles are attending a ball. It's one of the thrills of her lifetime. She's absolutely enchanted with the evening. She couldn't be happier. It's high society. There are beautiful ball gowns, beautiful men, champagne, dancing. For her, it's paradise. And here is the dialogue that Charles uses when they get home. It's good to be home. That's what he says. In those 5 little words, so much is conveyed. Flaubert, the author, didn't say, oh, Charles wasn't having a good time at the party, or Charles couldn't wait to get back. No, he did it through dialogue. And it says all of that and more. It stands in such dramatic contrast to how Emma was experiencing the evening. Now let's look at clothing. Try to always remember that the details we use should relate to the character and the story. We're going to look at how 2 different authors use clothing very differently for very different characters. In John Grisham's The Firm, we're introduced to McDear at an interview at the firm. This is another one in which the text is not going to directly align with the movie. McDear unbuttoned his coat and crossed his legs. He was now a seasoned veteran in the search of employment, and he knew they wanted him. He relaxed. With 3 job offers from 3 of the most prestigious firms in the country, he did not need this interview, this firm. He could afford to be a little overconfident now. He was there out of curiosity, and he longed for warmer weather. John Grisham used 2 little details. He crossed his leg, and the clothing detail, he unbuttoned his coat, to show that McDear is so relaxed, so confident, and that he's into that warmer climate. Now let's take a look at a very recent novel, Murder is a Fine Art, by David Morrell. We're in London, 1829, and are being introduced to Detective Inspector Sean Ryan. Ryan took only 5 minutes to dress, making sure that his gloves were in his shapeless jacket. Ryan, whose parents had emigrated from Ireland when he was a child, had tried hard to replace his Irish accent with a London one. His clothes were equally anonymous. Accustomed to working undercover, he wore a newspaper boy's cap that was pulled down so that his red hair wouldn't be noticed. You see how much clothing can say? On one hand, McDear is unbuttoning. On the other hand, Ryan is wearing a shapeless jacket, tucking his hair into his hat. Completely different effect. Your characterizations should align with what you're trying to show about the character. When you're having trouble with a character, Stein always advises that you visualize them. How do they move through a room? How do they speak? What are they wearing? He talks about having edited a book that really wasn't working. It was about a man, his wife, and his mistress. And Stein says the husband and the wife were characterized very well, but the mistress was very one note. She was just all about the sex. There was nothing else there. She wasn't working. And then he asked the author, how do you visualize her walking through a room? The author said she would walk through a room like a young lion. And that changed everything. He had never described her with masculine traits before. Then he started introducing those masculine traits, those lion-like traits, throughout the novel. And it made her come to life. That book went on to become a #1 New York bestseller for 37 consecutive weeks. That's the difference it can make sometimes when you think about your character's actions, how they appear visually. Here are some examples of psychological attributes. He dealt with his friends as if they were employees. He talked and they listened. She was only 9 years old, but she could look directly into your soul as if in a previous life she had been a grand inquisitor and your lies were condemning you. Now that we have the basics down, we're going to have some fun. We're going to show how a character can slip through our changing perceptions, how we can create marvelous and effective contrasts in a reader's expectations. Here's James Wood's example. That's a really good one. A man enters a room in which a woman and a man are standing. He speaks first to the woman and ignores the man. The reader thinks, he's that kind of man. But then the novelist reveals that the woman he's talking to is extremely unattractive. And suddenly, the extraordinary capacity of the novel speaks. Unlike in movies, the novelist can tell us what the character is thinking. And in free, indirect style, it says, Mother, very traditional in her way, had always instructed him that a gentleman should talk first to the least attractive woman in the room to make her feel at ease. Simple chivalry. From one sentence to the next, the reader's expectations are confounded. The character starts off on the wrong foot and ends up being someone with very quaint, old-fashioned manners, someone we quite like. An effective contrast can be used in a single sentence. Here's Stein. A woman dressed in an immaculately tailored gray suit, her hair kept, her posture markedly straight, and she was picking her nose. The reader should have a misplaced sense of certainty. Try not to give them exactly what they think is going on. Effective characters mislead us with their actions or behavior again and again. Here's a movie that James Wood talks about, which he adores, which shows this effect really well. In Antonioni's film L'Eclisse, a woman visits her fiancé at the Rome Stock Exchange, who points out a fat man who has just lost 50 million lire. Intrigued, she follows him. He goes to a bar to order a drink and barely touches it. He goes to a cafe and orders water. He doesn't take a single sip. She watches him. He writes something on a piece of paper and leaves it. We imagine he's writing down numbers, a furious, melancholy set of figures. She picks up the paper and sees that he has drawn flowers. It's a poignant scene, so tender and surprising. We have a fixed idea of how someone would react to a financial catastrophe. Fury, despair, perhaps a suicide note. But Antonioni confounds our expectations. As a writer, you understand what a reader is likely to think in a given scenario. When you subvert their expectations, it gives the character so much more depth. Obviously, this has to be aligned with who the character is. But think past what the obvious reaction is. Think 1-2 steps further. What else is there? What else would really reveal who this person is? People's reactions, their choices, are not always what we expect. And that's what life consists of. And that's what gives life to characters as well. With this little scene, Antonioni reveals something deep and sharp about this man's temperament. And he makes a statement of how humans can choose not to bend under extreme pressure. Here's my example from a book I often recommend, Javier Marias's A Heart So White. A girl has just committed suicide in the bathroom while her family eats dinner. And in this scene, Javier describes the father's reaction. Think about how you would depict a character in that situation. Your first thought is probably, crying out, a lot of sobbing and wailing, and that would probably be the focus. But let's take a look at what Javier does. When they heard the shot, some 5 minutes after the girl had left the table, her father didn't get up at once, but stayed there for a few seconds, paralyzed, his mouth still full of food, not daring to chew or swallow, far less to spit the food out onto his plate. And when he finally did get up and run to the bathroom, those who followed him noticed that when he discovered the blood-splattered body of his daughter and clutched his head in his hands, he kept passing the mouthful of meat from one cheek to the other, still not knowing what to do with it. It's so different, isn't it? It's so different when you pick up these unusual and very human reactions that are not obvious. Here's a nonfiction example that plays with contrast, that plays with the reader's expectations. And it's something that you've probably encountered in a lot of nonfiction books, and otherwise fiction books as well. but it's useful to look at it again through the lens of what we just learned today. So this is Good to Great, a book by Jim Collins. In 1971, a seemingly ordinary man named Darwin E. Smith became chief executive of Kimberly-Clark, a stodgy old paper company whose stock had fallen 36% behind the general market over the previous 20 years. Smith, the company's mild-mannered in-house lawyer, wasn't so sure the board had made the right choice, a feeling further reinforced when the director pulled Smith aside and reminded him that he lacked some of the qualifications for the position. But CEO he was, and CEO he remained for 20 years. Smith is described as an ordinary man, a mild-mannered man. And then the action comes in. Remember, the 5 ways to characterize? Can't just describe, you should also show an action. So Jim Collins does exactly that. The director pulls Smith aside and says, "You're not qualified for this position." And then, of course, comes the effective contrast. He was CEO for 20 years. And there we have it. How to select details that will intrigue a reader, how to play with a reader's perceptions to keep them engaged and to add depth to a character. Last week's giveaway went so well, we're going to do it again. This week, the winner is going to get the 2 books we talked about today. So Stein on writing and How Fiction Works. It's one thing to listen to the information and assume that you've got it, you're good, you've absorbed it, and it's another to try to actually use it as quickly as possible. So that's part of the reason behind this giveaway. Is I'd like to encourage you to try to use it in the comments, and if you do, I think just by challenging yourself to do it, you're immediately going to start to develop a better sense for what we talked about today. So, having said that, what is the actual comment? Glad you asked. Using, well, 1 or more, hopefully more, of the characterizations we talked about, introduce this man. Bonus points if you can introduce a contrast within 2 sentences. Please give 5 other people your thumbs up, and the commenter with the most thumbs up wins. If you like this video, please also give the video a thumbs up and subscribe, and I'd love to see you next week. In the meantime, see you in the comments. Bye.